Well, hello and welcome back, my friend. And this week I'm joined by Andrew Petty. And Andrew and I had a great time to talk when we were at Podcast Movement just a few months ago. Andrew's got an amazing story where he ended up going through some debilitating anxiety in his 20s. And then about 15, 20 years later, he was faced with reflecting on his own life because his brother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer, pretty extreme cancer. And so I'm assuming you've gone through a situation where a loved one, somebody close to you has passed. And those, man, they can just trigger us. They almost hit us like right in the gut and cause us to reflect. But Andrew was different than just the reflecting. He took action. So we're going to dive into that as well. And this is going to be a really good one. I'm excited to talk about the changes that he brought about in his life, how he did it. And something we don't talk much about is like mortality and regrets and how that all can stack up if we don't take action today. Regardless of what's going on, we have today, we have that time. And so we're going to touch on some really deep stuff. Really excited to talk with Andrew about this. Andrew, how are you doing today, my friend?
Awesome. And glad to be here, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
How are you?
Great to chat again. I'm doing phenomenal, man. I'm pumped because I remember our last chat when we first met. It was like, dude, where have you been?
Yeah.
It's like one of those you just gravitate, and it's like those friends that you've always had but didn't know you had.
Yeah.
And
Kindred spirits. Yeah.
Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. So you're also my wordsmith. That title goes out to you right now, Andrew. Well, hey, let's kick it off. What does life look like for you on the professional side of life now?
I'm a life coach. I have a podcast called Andrew Petty is Dying, masterminds called the Graveyard Group, and also do one-on-one coaching. And more recently, established something called Growth Camp, which currently is built around the hero's journey framework for helping us have not only a tool for viewing our past with greater clarity, but also a compass for moving forward with more courage, purpose, focus, and direction into our future. So we become more proactive agents in the creation of our future. And I do that out of Steamboat Springs, Colorado, where I live here with my wife of almost 19 years and my two boys, 11 and 14. And I work with folks here locally. I work with folks remotely. And I've been doing that since about 2016 in one way or another. There was sort of a pre-COVID version of that profession, and there was a post-COVID version of that profession, driven by some of the economic hardships that came about then. So, but that's me in a nutshell now.
Gotcha. And dude, Steamboat Springs is beautiful, especially like going skiing, but also in the summer, dude, you
come see me. My office is right on the river. And then just down to my right is a great taco place. Just down to my left is all kinds of other things. And I've got the Howison, the old school ski mountain across the way and the new one to my left. So come on, I'm in a great spot. Come see me.
I'm packing my bags afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump into the other side. What is personal, like on the personal side of life? What does that look like for you?
So like I mentioned, I've got the wife and two boys, and we moved out here in 2014 to get our bodies where our hearts had been for a long time. Steamboat Springs got on the map because my wife's family's been here since the late 1990s. And I was working back east at a church where I'd been for 14 years in a communications capacity, and gradually realized the more we came out to visit here, the more depressed we were when we returned home. And part of my story is what it took to actually propel us out of that status quo that we were in and into a new adventure that we began in Steamboat back in 2014. Fortunate to be in Steamboat, where it's on many levels a tight-knit community, but it's also has a fair amount of diversity. I wouldn't say things like ethnic diversity and that as much as I would say just different mountain towns and beach towns. I think attract people who are looking for a geographic fix. Now that's a gross generalization, but it's common for us to pursue geographic fixes as a remedy for anything we find amiss internally in our lives, or just to address dissatisfaction. And so a whole host of different people come to mountain or beach towns, in my estimation, to attempt to get that geographic fix. And one of the interesting things about that is there's no such thing. And so often people come to mountain and beach towns and find that not only is their dissatisfaction not gone away, sometimes it's compounded because the remedy they thought they would find remains elusive. And so being in a small mountain town is a really fascinating place to do the work that I and people like you do, because you just never know the story that you're going to encounter. My podcast, of course, has a lot of those folks featured on it, who've had these remarkable encounters and remarkable transformations. We spend a fair amount of time outside doing, outside stuff, the skiing, the biking, camping. Got, my boys 11, 14 keep us on our toes. So, and we love being here with my wife's family.
That's cool. Yeah. Being in a place where you can be outdoors and that's something that speaks to you. Dude, that's a great combination there.
One of the things I love about Steamboat is it has all the elements and really dramatically so. And I found that having the changing of the seasons is a way to continue to shift through the gears of our life. And it would be difficult for me to live somewhere where the climate was the same all the time. Because there's just something about the changes of the seasons that helps you shift through the gears of your life. And it's a constant cycle of death and rebirth, which is, the pattern for the human experience at its most basic level.
No, that absolutely makes sense, man. I get it. Well, hey, let's jump into your story. And like I alluded to earlier, in your early 20s, like you were experiencing like some debilitating anxiety. Anxiety can be crippling. It doesn't really matter like what it's so much stemming from, but just the anxiety itself, right? It can shut us down. What was it looking like for you? Like, did you know what was causing it? And I guess what kind of impact did it have on you once it, reared up its head?
Short answer is no, I didn't know it was causing it. With the benefit of hindsight, though, my armchair psychologizing leads me to believe that it was the culmination of years of accumulated psychological load. And my psyche reached a breaking point, and the result was this going from fairly normally functioning according to certain metrics to suddenly not functioning. The load psychically just became too much. And again, with the benefit of hindsight, I see that anxiety had been present in my life for as long as I could remember, but never to degrees that were severe enough or durations long enough for people around me to go, that doesn't seem quite right for a kid his age or for a kid at his stage of development, because it would sort of flare up and then be tamped down. And, my parents have said we just weren't aware of what was going on. And, that's often the case for we as parents. I mean, we're doing what we can. We're trying to stay in tune with our kids, and we're also doing the work and the job. And, we want things to be well. So sometimes we just believe that they're well, even if things aren't really. So I think it was years of accumulated psychological load, of a deeply intense interpersonal life that wasn't being vented or accessed externally in ways that kind of bled that energy off. And in time, it just erupted. Now, the specific circumstances were I had graduated college, and in my senior year, lost my starting spot on the soccer team. My own psychology was such that, I thought if anything on the soccer field happened that was detrimental, it was somehow my fault. And you can't perform at a high level as an athlete when you think that everything that happens on the field is ultimately traceable back to you. And so by the time I was at the end of my junior year, that psychological load had really so deteriorated my performance that I lost my starting spot. And that was a big blow to me, because soccer had been a significant building block of my identity. It was probably good that building block got, sort of wedged out, because that's not a good foundation to build our lives on. But it was at that point, I think, that some depression began to set in. And, take my senior year, a year or two following that, I was doing some cool things. I was working at a ranch out in Colorado, but there was just this undercurrent of sadness and uncertainty and depression. And by the time I got probably 2 or 3 years out of college, there was a triggering event, and that was that I began to have some vague physical symptoms that I definitely was experiencing, but I couldn't really describe very well. And the medical community couldn't help me understand what was going on either. And at the same time, my mom's dad had died of a heart attack after living 18 years on a quadruple bypass. And so my mom was very sensitized to anything cardiac related. And I'm telling her about what I'm experiencing. She goes, "Gosh, that sounds cardiac." And it was like, boom. I mean, this generalized anxiety that had been sort of shuffling around in my heart and mind for something to grab onto just went, whoonk, that's it. And so the flavor of anxiety that began to really beset me was just paralyzing fear of catastrophic health events and mortality. And I went from functioning okay, but still with not a lot of direction in my life, to just really unable to function, but above the, barely above the bare minimum. I had pretty menial jobs in stock rooms and retail locations, definitely underperforming in terms of my capacity, but barely holding it together. It was miserable.
So,
I mean, there was a point at which, and I remember very clearly in the very early stages of the anxiety, that I remember saying to myself, if this doesn't change, I will not stick around longer. This is so painful that I cannot live much longer like that. And I realized, oh, that's what they call a suicidal thought. This is serious. I've got to begin figuring this out. So to anyone out there suffering from anxiety, whether you are aware of some of the origins of it or not, and I'm still not very clear on it. And there's some family history. There are enough breadcrumbs to lead me to believe that maybe something or some set of things happened earlier than I'm able to remember. I mean, it just is sort of like something's missing here. But to anyone who's experiencing it, my heart goes out to you. It is extremely painful. It's an extremely painful private battle. It's also a battle that can bring with it an intense amount of shame. And I think for we men, especially so. And if it is relevant in this conversation today, I'll just share how at one point, just a few years ago, I realized how shame-ridden I was by the fact that anxiety had been one of my chief battles as an adult, because no one can see it. It's easy for other people to think that I ought to be able to just deal with it and move on, or medicate it and move on. But when you're the one dealing with it, it feels very different than that. And you do not feel as if it's something you can just simply move on from. So there's a lot of shame associated with it too. And for anyone out there struggling with anxiety, my heart goes out to you. It's very, very difficult. And there is hope. There is a way forward.
Yeah, there absolutely is. It's one of those of taking action, jumping in, letting go of that shame, right? It's something that will put up perceived hurdles if we allow it to, but when we step into it and go, this is bigger than what needs to just sit off to the side. I guess one question, when you look back prior to that, like your college time, you look back to junior high and high school, what kind of student were you? And is there anything where you look back and go, yeah, I can see that I was struggling with like an emotional or mental load at that time that may have not been visible to, family, because as kids, sometimes we just don't share that stuff. Is there anything that was going on like that? And
yeah, I mean, I was really a golden child. I was a rock star, and I don't say that in any sort of boasting way, but that was just, if you looked at me, all of the normal cultural metrics were just off the charts. Excelling academically, excelling athletically. If one can do this, I was excelling spiritually according to the observable metrics. And so for my parents, it was kind of like, well, what do you do with a kid that doesn't appear to have any area where he's struggling? I guess he's okay. And, to all the parents out there, I would say, sometimes it's apparent when our kids are struggling, and sometimes it's not. Whether or not they appear to be struggling, do what you can to create and maintain open channels of communication that give them a safe environment in which to share what's really happening on the inside. Because I think one of the most painful discrepancies I experienced growing up was the the discrepancy between the inward person and the outward person. And the more painful that distinction became, the more I poured myself into outward performance as a way to prop up the deficiencies I felt internally. And part of the pain of that was people would look at me and say, Andrew, you've got it all. I mean, you've got it all, man. What is the problem? And I'd be like, I don't know. And that was a particular pain for me. It was because I didn't understand it. I just knew that I hurt inside. So, parents, do what you can to create those conversations and keep the open lines of communication available for your child so that at least they know they can take advantage of them. Don't judge the book by the cover. Figure out how to dig into how your kid's really doing.
Yeah. Creating those conversations, those opportunities to say, like, not just how are you doing academically, but how are you feeling? Are you feeling stressed about the load that you're under? How much time are you relaxing? Sometimes we can be attuned to what our kid's going through, but sometimes, as kids, we get built up in portraying a certain role, looking good, but not feeling in line with at all what we're displaying on the outside. So yeah, it's something to walk through and definitely be communicating mindfully and intentionally. As you moved from, like, when you had the anxiety and you're like, oh my gosh, dropped off the team, right, in your senior year and those couple of years following, were you able to get clarity on what was going on and how to move through it, or did it kind of continue to be something that was holding you back from your performance? Because you talked about, hey, I was just keeping my head above water, right? You're with a life vest, and what you're capable of seems so far out of reach, but you're doing the best you can with where you are. How did life progress from those couple of years afterwards?
There were some providential interventions, and I use the word providential consciously, purposely. A pastor at a church that I was a part of befriended me and allowed me the opportunity to just begin unloading the many, many years of accumulated stuff within me that had never really been put on deposit with anyone else or sorted through verbally for myself. And so there were many evenings I was in his living room just talking and he was just listening. And that allowed me to begin to find some footing, even though the anxiety really persisted, in pretty significant ways for many, many years. And I still have a propensity toward that. And I can tell when it's beginning to try to get my attention and want me to engage. So it's still there. But in those early years, being able to put on deposit with someone else, someone who I could trust, someone who I could tell cared and was competent in terms of their ability to receive and manage the extremities of human emotion, was critical. So I did begin to find some solid footing. I found my first sort of adult vocational chapter, which I was in for 14 years at that church that pastor led. Was fortunate enough to get my act together enough to draw to my side a wonderful woman. So I got married, and then we had two wonderful boys within 2.5 years of each other. And so some of the external, what would we call them, fixtures of an adult life were beginning to come into play. And I would say that I think it's in vogue today to call those things optional. And I realize for some people, those things aren't always an option. They may want them, but they remain elusive for reasons that may be clear or may not be clear. And so there's a certain subset of people for whom those things aren't available for a variety of reasons. But, for most of us, I think those external fixtures, committed marriage partnership, the bringing of kids into the world and the rearing of kids, I think those are really essential fixtures in our world in order to begin to force some of the points of maturity in our lives that allow us to move beyond points of immaturity. And that certainly was true for me, and allowed me to have some of these watershed moments developmentally that allowed me to escape the gravitational pull of the anxiety and move forward anyway into new chapters and into new phases that allow me to then continue to break free of the gravitational pull of the anxiety even more. And you mentioned earlier, the antidote to anxiety being action, and I wholeheartedly affirm that as valid and true, because that's been my experience, and I think that holds up, theoretically in all respects.
Yeah, I know sitting on my couch, wallowing in, my thoughts about the anxiety and depression just takes me further down. For some people, it looks different. I know that for myself and a number of people, that has been a helpful component, right? It may not be the whole solution, but it's at least something to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So you began, having your family filling out the anxiety kind of, diminishing or not being as frequent, debilitating. And then when
Here's what
you
I think.
got,
Here's what I think it was, Mike. It was that,
yeah,
at least in part, it was that when you have a committed marriage partnership and the needs of two young humans in your midst, unless you completely abdicate those responsibilities, you don't have the opportunity to give to your internal woes as much attention as you might have in the absence of those things and those people. That's part of the value of having those things in our world. And I think that they're, not to serve us necessarily, but they do serve us in our development. So I think it's very difficult to become the human being that we can become apart from those kinds of external influences, inviting those responsibilities into our world.
yeah. And also having, like you talked about the pastor, listening to you, having somebody to confide in, that community, your wife can be obviously part of the support system, but part of that community, but having other people as well, particularly if, as men, having other men that can speak into us, listen, encourage us. I mean, that's all a powerful component, part of the puzzle to help us to get that foundation and get our footing, clear-headed, motivated, just moving in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
Not just churning the water, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think isolation was a big part of what had allowed many of the psychological and emotional woes that I experienced to, it was the proverbial dark within which the bacteria could grow. There wasn't an outflow of me to other people around me that cared, and a reciprocal inflow of them to me, so that I could, and without that exchange, there's the Dead Sea is dead because there's no outlet to open water. And we need to be in a constant state of inflow and outflow as humans in order to grow and be healthy and to mature and to be all that we can be. And that wasn't the case for me, for a variety of reasons, some of which I'm aware of and some of which I'm not. But what I do know now is how essential that is.
Yeah. It's definitely a key component for me. And I've told the guys, if you don't hear from me, reach out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, we can still hide. It's one of those habits that we've coped with, but it's not beneficial at all for, my health and growth.
Mike, I want to make a point real quick, if you don't mind. And that
Sure.
is that,
Yeah.
as I just recount my story, I think it's easy, even if it's not made explicit in the recounting, to find an implicit theme of like victimhood and poor Andrew, that he had this experience, this anxiety experience. And I want to really diffuse any of that that may be emerging in our conversation today, because even though some of the things that brought about my experience of anxiety were probably not of my doing, it is my conviction that when we move into adulthood, whatever we bring into adulthood, whether we caused it or not, is now our responsibility. And one of the things that's become clear to me is that when we move beyond the jurisdiction of our parents into autonomous living in the world and trying to find our way, our parents graduate from their parenting duties, and we now assume the responsibility of parenting ourselves to maturity. And I think it's a helpful way of thinking about it, so that we don't slip into this vortex of victimhood that then creates this negative feedback loop in our lives and creates all sorts of self-fulfilling prophecies. So yeah, my parents graduate. Now I move into adulthood. Now I'm my parent. And so what resources do I need to bring to bear into my life in order to continue to help myself to mature along a productive and meaningful path?
Yeah, that's a powerful point. That was one boat that I missed for the longest time.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Me too.
it was one, yeah, that's a common theme for us, right? I think that it was one that, when I accepted responsibility and then forgave my parents and realized they did the best that they could, as much as I felt it was lacking and there were things that were hurtful along the way, it was either cut the ropes to the dock, where I'm feeling, hey, I'm Eeyore, woe is me. And like you talked about, take that action and move myself along. Because what happened happened. And if I continue to hold on to it, it's just going to keep me in that same place. I'm not going to move forward. I'm going to, fall behind, stay stagnant emotionally and mentally. And it just hurts, not only me, but it's also hurting my family, my wife and my children.
And if
For
we
my
want to be
case,
really brutally honest about it, when we allow ourselves to stay stuck in those places of victimhood and woe is me, and they did this to me, and so how can you expect me to possibly move on? In adulthood, it becomes a thinly veiled and not so clever way of avoiding responsibility and of avoiding moving forward in ways that create vulnerabilities and exposure and expose us to risk and all the things that are necessary in order for us to move forward and produce and accomplish something in the world. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we really break the power of that in our lives. When we stay stuck in that pattern and continue to blame circumstances or other people for our failures to thrive, we may not consciously register it, but deep on a deep level, it is feeding back into that narrative that we're not competent and we can't do it. And it feeds into this self-loathing and all the things that can lead men to think poorly of themselves and to underperform. And so we've really got as men to say, hold up, the buck stops here with me. I don't know how it all came to this moment, but from this moment forward, I'm not going to accept anyone being responsible for myself but me. I'm 100% responsible for me, and I'm going to learn how to be appropriately responsible for other people. And I think if all of us in the world made that switch in this moment right now, the world would immediately become a higher functioning, better place to live in. Because one of the underlying maladies of the human condition is blame shifting and not assuming responsibility. And it cannot be underestimated or overestimated how unbelievably cancerous that is. And for we
yeah,
men, especially, because we are made to go on missions, to go on adventures, to accomplish, to push the borders and the frontiers. And that can be physical frontiers and borders. It can be mental. It can be, you name it, technical. I mean, there are all kinds of frontiers that we can venture into, but I think we're especially made for that. And I don't mean to say that women aren't, but there's something in men that rises to that occasion, that gets inspired by thoughts of that. And when we shrink back from that, we know what we're doing, and it causes us to hate ourselves even more. And we've got to take ownership and then say, hold on, no, I'm going to, there's 6 things I found that I think are essential ingredients in the recipe for a life we'll be outrageously proud of when we die. And I just call them the big 6. And in order of significance, they cascade on each other. I think it's courage, humility, truth telling, self permission, self responsibility, and self knowledge. There's nothing meaningful in life that I've yet discovered that doesn't first involve courage. It takes courage to love. It takes courage to trust. It takes courage to be humble. That's why humility is second. But humility allows us to say, I'm going to be precisely who I am in the world, no more and no less, so that as I present that version of myself to the world, it can be tested against reality, and its deficiencies can be revealed, and its competencies can be revealed, such that I can amplify my competencies and find remedies for my deficiencies, or find ways to mitigate the impact of those deficiencies. So I think the big 6 are really powerful ingredients for everyone. And we're talking to men, especially today, Mike, especially for we men to get serious about. And the good news about this recipe, my wife and I both hate to cook. So we like ingredients with like one or two, recipes of one or two ingredients. And the good thing about this recipe is all you have to do is add more, and you're creating something good.
Well, and as you talk about like taking responsibility and, moving forward, taking into account where you're at when you were 36, I believe. So, your brother-in-law ended up being diagnosed with, serious cancer. And that incident, like the realization of the mortality of him being so young, you being so young, but yet this, even with him having a family, reflected and caused you to take, inventory. Where am I at? Where do I want to go? What did life look like then? And then what decisions came after that kind of announcement of where he was at?
Yeah, I didn't have to look very far to take stock. All I had to do was look down at my gut and find that I was 50 to 60 pounds over my fighting weight. And that was a consequence of me deciding somewhere along the line that the only real battle I was going to fight was against the anxiety, and I was going to just live and let live on the other frontiers, and also pick up some really unfortunate coping habits along the way that included abusing alcohol as a way to mitigate the intensity of the anxiety in the moment, and also picked up smoking, wasn't exercising, eating whenever I wanted. And he got the cancer diagnosis. I looked down at my gut, looked at my beautiful wife and boys, and went, wow, I don't know when I'm going to die, and I can't exactly control it, but I'm not doing what I can to keep myself in this world. And it was like, bam. I mean, nothing had ever lit a fire under me like the awareness of my mortality and a clear why for sticking around, in the form of my family. And within 9 months, I had lost all that weight. I was back to my fighting weight. My nutrition was being overhauled. I was slowly learning to move away from those bad coping habits. And it was just, it was such a transformation that people around me began to express concern. Like, and this is in the southeastern Virginia, where like casseroles and, second and third and fourth helpings are the norm. They began to ask, are you okay? I mean, Andrew, eat a little more. And I said, no, actually, this is what healthy looks like. Before I was, I was in the slow decline into middle age mediocrity. And so I didn't register it back then the way that I register it now, but mortality kicked my butt into shape in a way that nothing else ever had. And in the therapeutic world, the coaching world that you and I inhabit, we're always looking for those things that will help resolve the ambivalence that I want to, but I don't want to, that'll slowly get someone moving more in the direction of I want to and taking action in that direction. And, we spend a lot of time looking for the whys and this, that, and the other. Well, what I found was that mortality cut through all of that. I didn't have to fiddle around with all of my, my unformed habits and lack of discipline. It was like, you're going to die eventually. You're not helping yourself live. What matters to you most? Okay, get after it. And so it was a stark realization that created a big transformation in my own life. And then fast forwarding a number of years, when I got into the coaching work, I realized, holy smoke, I have a somewhat neurotic fixation with mortality because of the anxious edge that I bring to it. But maybe most of us in the Western affluent world don't think about it enough, which is why I've brought that into the work that I do now.
Well, I think in like our current state, we're so comfortable. There's nothing that's pushing us to that point of realizing our mortality, that we may not live until the expected age of, 70, 80, whatever, that it's going to be smooth sailing just as it's been. And, Monday through Sunday, I'm able to live just as I am yesterday. And so there's nothing threatening us to really cause that reflection until somebody does pass.
Until
right?
there is something threatening us. And often then it's too little too late, too much water under the bridge. You can't go back and recoup the losses in relationships. Too little too late. And, the comforts and conveniences that we've created in the affluent Western world are wonderful. I don't at all feel guilty for them. I mean, they're the remarkable accomplishments of human engineering and ingenuity, and comfort and conveniences kill, period. If that's where we stop. In my opinion, the comforts and conveniences that we've accrued in the affluent Western world are meant to create this remarkable launch pad, this of extravagant resourcing from which we can then move forward to do things that the rest of the world doesn't find available to them because of different resourcing. But we affluent Westerners get situated in our comfort and our convenience, and then are befuddled as to why we're unhappy. And it's because those comforts and conveniences were never sources of contentment to begin with. True sources of contentment for the human animal are found in adventure, in risk, in vulnerability, in pushing the boundaries, in pursuing new frontiers, in allowing ourselves to experience discomfort. And that's why I say comfort kills. And I think it's one of the things that in the 21st century is causing our culture to somewhat fold in upon itself as we all attempt to avoid any pangs of discomfort or anything that would be unpleasant, when in fact that's what we need to be moving toward. It's a big deal. Comfort kills.
Does comfort also feed into like regret, right? When we think of mortality, we think of a man on his deathbed that talks about, I regret not having done that. Do you see that when you step out of your comfort, that it decreases the likelihood of regrets, or is there any kind of correlation there?
100%. I mean, all the people that you hear about from deathbed accounts, the most painful regrets are around relationships, unmended relationships, relationships not pursued, words not said, and also things not attempted. So much less rarely do people regret things tried and, that either didn't work out as they hoped or, just didn't get the result they'd hoped. But people regret not doing the things that they dreamed of. And so for sure. And it's easy in the affluent Western world to let one day roll into the next. And what I found so valuable about mortality is it reminds us, I've only got today. There is never tomorrow. The benefit of there's multiple benefits of training ourselves to think about that way and cultivating what I call the mortality mindset. Number one, it dramatically simplifies our lives because I've only got today. I can only deal with what's in front of me today. What is available to me that I can influence or control to make today as great a day as I can make it. And when I'm on my game, I might start a day by thinking, if today ended well, what would that look like? I would have called my sister, or I would have had that difficult conversation with a friend that needed to be had, or I would have tackled that work project that I've been putting off. And I know if I keep putting it off and never do it, I'll regret. It's easy to live in one day increments. But we get lulled into thinking that we have multiple one day increments, and we really don't. So it dramatically simplifies life, and it focuses our existence. And then it forces some urgency into our existence where maybe you've been thinking about calling that friend, but just haven't. Make the call. And when we do that work, it compounds positively toward our inevitable demise, and reduces the number of regrets that we might experience on our deathbed. And it works against that negative compounding interest of undone things and unfulfilled relationships and all of that. So, the hero's journey is a framework that I have become so enamored with. And many of you and many of our listeners might be familiar with it. But it's an ancient framework that was, really well formulated by Joseph Campbell in the 20th century, and is derived from all of mankind's most ancient mythologies. And it basically demonstrates that there's one story that humanity has been living out over the eons and for as long as humanity has been around. And it's the story of the normal person living in their status quo normal world, being called to either an involuntary or moving toward a voluntary adventure. And that adventure inevitably takes them out of their status quo in their known world and into an unknown realm full of uncertainty and perils. And along the way, they acquire companions and allies and go through trials of character and physical trials. And sometimes there's actual dragons to slay in mythology, but sometimes those dragons are in dragons of anxiety or dragons of relationship. But always behind that dragon is the treasure that we seek and the treasure that we need. And Joseph Campbell said, the cave that we fear to enter holds the treasure that we seek. And as we continue through that underworld of the unknown, we eventually emerge back into the normal world, but now transformed and with treasure in tow to offer the rest of the world. That is a path to deep contentment, meaning, and fulfillment. It's a path of tremendous discomfort as well. But we avoid that discomfort at our peril. We engage that discomfort to our great benefit and the world's great benefit.
Yeah. It's one that we don't have to look very far to see that hero's journey played out, right? We can look in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker being sent by Yoda into the cave. I mean, that is right there. It's played out in many of those stories. It's a thread that just continues through, and that's why I think it's so relatable. Is it's been in the storytelling that we've been, told. When you look back, what are like some resources that helped you, or as you've become, to a healthier, more mortality driven mindset, what are some resources that you look back and were like, I wish I had this. This would have been, beneficial to me in my journey?
One of them that was really instrumental for me was a concept from psychology called the drama triangle. It's derived from a framework called transactional analysis, which is a way of understanding interactions between people. And just as briefly as I can, the drama triangle is sort of a sub framework derived from transactional analysis that identifies three different states of victimhood that each of us as adults sometimes use. Victim, which is classic victim. I feel helpless. I feel hopeless. I need others to help me. I don't understand myself. I don't know how to find my way in the world. There's persecutor, which is the world's out to get me. Everybody's got to take care of their own. I'll get mine. You get yours. Then there's rescuer, which is looking for a victim to help. And each of these states of victimhood are derived from our families of origin and our early childhood experience, when we learned to fulfill a certain role in our family in order to find our place and to find a way to succeed and thrive. The problem is that we move into adulthood, if we don't become aware of our default mode, then we continue to play out that script in ways that become increasingly destructive in our relationships. And it just is on repeat. And one relationship doesn't work out, we make a lateral move to another one. That one works maybe a little bit longer, then that one fizzles out and we move on. And it helped me to see that I'd come into adulthood in classic victim default mode, and that it was time for me to take responsibility and figure out how to become competent and to get off of that drama triangle. Often what we do, instead of, when we realize, we tend to bounce between these three: victim, persecutor, and rescuer. So victim needs a rescuer. Persecutor, I probably am not going to get this all right, but a persecutor likes a victim to be able to demean. A rescuer is always attempting to save. So we tend to bounce between those different functions in order to extract from the other person the need that we need to have met, or the response that we want to have met. It's a completely dysfunctional cycle. Any of us can look at some of the relationships in our lives and see some elements of that. But that framework helped me to acknowledge that I'd come into adulthood in the classic victim role, and it was mine to figure out how to escape the drama triangle and begin to take complete responsibility for myself and appropriate responsibility for others. It was hard to see, especially as a dude. I think to acknowledge, that I've been a victim is sort of like, that's low. Actually that disgust around seeing that was part of what motivated me. Like, I got to get rid of that, because that's not good for me or anybody. So transactional analysis and the drama triangle I found to be very useful. You can find tons of information about that online. In the past 3 to 4 years, a distance mentor of sorts, someone who doesn't know me, but who I know very well through their content, has been Jordan Peterson. And he's probably been the single most influential mentor in my life, period, bar none, full stop. Because his message around responsibility as a path to meaning and purpose, responsibility as a path toward happiness and contentment, that probably is one of the 2 or 3 primary themes in what he's offering to the world that I found especially useful. And I think especially for men to be particularly useful in the 21st century. My armchair psychologizing says that what it is to be a man has been um, labeled as fundamentally toxic and destructive. And for men coming into adulthood in that environment who are said that uh, their manhood, just by virtue of its existence, is bad, is a very, very harmful thing to experience. And like I said earlier, I think men are made for missions, we're made for adventure, we're made for conquering. And to grow up in that environment, you have an intense identity crisis from day one on your hands. And so I would encourage anyone who hasn't tuned in Jordan Peterson to listen to him. He is on the cultural front, somewhat polarizing figure. That doesn't bother me. I think anything of substance will polarize. But listen to him with an open mind and an open heart. He's got gobs of stuff online to listen to. I just decided a few years ago that I would enroll myself in what I called Jordan Peterson Academy. Didn't exist at that point, but I decided I'm going to do a deep dive and see what's there. And interestingly enough, even though he's not a Christian, or wasn't at least, and I am, he reintroduced the Bible to me in a way that I'd never experienced. In fact, his Bible teaching, quote unquote, has been some of the most transformative I've ever experienced, just in his personal pursuit of trying to understand what it is in this book that has allowed the phenomenon of Western civilization to emerge. So Jordan Peterson, Drama Triangle, other resources. I'm going to leave it at that because those have been two of the most significant, to be honest with you.
Yeah, those are pretty impactful.
Yeah.
For me, like when you're talking about a responsibility, another one for me was like Jocko Willink.
Extreme ownership, that whole idea.
Yeah, dude, that hit hard. I was like, I don't like this. Why not? And doing that whole dive, It was like, ouch. Okay, well, step up or step off, And yeah. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing all that you have about, facing the anxiety that you had, how that built up and then kind of played out, how you took responsibility, identified that, and stepped in despite the discomfort of it, right? And sharing that it's like in the discomfort is where we grow. That's where we need to be doing the adventure, out on mission, for ourselves and for our family. And then the whole concept of mortality, which is something I don't think we really give credence to, as far as being that motivation that just cut through all the excuses. So, how can men connect with you outside of this podcast?
I realize we're at time, but I feel like there's one thing I'd like to add in order to help make sense of my story even more. And it's that about 4 years ago, the anxiety was still there, and most of my efforts had been largely to get rid of it, to fight it, to combat it, to make it go away. And I just reached this point of exasperation. It wasn't some sudden flash of wisdom or insight. It was just like, oh, you're still here. And I just sort of, in my heart and in my mind's eye, turned to it and went, well, what are you here for? I didn't get a response back, but I began to relate to the anxiety differently. I acknowledged it. I didn't just try to push it away. And slowly but surely, the anxiety became an unexpected but strangely welcome ally, because I began to see myself differently. And it began to inspire me and create and be a source of creativity for me. And it's very difficult to describe what happened, but I would just encourage anyone who is dealing with some sort of internal demon like that a better way to, in my experience, a better way to, quote, combat that thing is to stop resisting it, to pause and ask what it's there for. You could say the same of any kind of stuckness we're experiencing, because instinctively, when stuckness shows up in our lives, we want to get rid of it. Can I move past this? And stuckness is always there to tell us something. And the right way to interact with stuckness is to pause and go, what are you here for? You've got a message. And in that way, we can then receive the message we need to receive and find a new way forward. And it was really out of renovating my relationship with anxiety, again, not out of any stroke of genius on my part, but out of exasperation, that then it became a source of creativity for me. And the graveyard group grew out of that. And the podcast grew out of that as I realized, hey, I've been wrestling with mortality in an anxious and neurotic way all these years. Maybe others of us in the affluent Western world don't think about it enough. And turns out that's true on a conscious level. However, each of us is living each moment of every day on some level in relationship to our mortality. And typically, if it's not being consciously brought to the forefront of our hearts and minds, we're living in reaction to and avoidance of our mortality. And that really is a very poor motivation for a full life. And what I've discovered is that as I've embraced mortality and brought it close to me, it's begun to heal me of the very thing that used to be so destructive in my life, and it's life affirming. And so I hope anybody listening can understand that in courageously and voluntarily engaging our mortality, we fortify ourselves and we fill ourselves with life and energy. And it is the most life affirming, most empowering and encouraging thing we can do is to actually embrace our mortality. So again, whatever it is that you find besetting you, pause, relax, turn around, address that thing, ask what it's there for, and you'll be surprised with what you find. One of the things I've found is that the thing that I've hated all my life and considered emasculating and weak and shameful has become a superpower for me. And I'm sure, Mike, there are areas of your life you can relate to or like that. And many of the folks listening can relate to that. So our imperfections are a key to understanding our purpose in the world. Our story and our purpose in the world are inseparable. Thanks for letting me add that last little bit.
Absolutely. I think it's so funny is like you're talking about that. I'm like, pain avoidance, mortality thought avoidance, responsibility avoidance. That's how we get in trouble. At least I know that was like the straight and narrow path. It's like, where's this going to get you? So yeah. Well, let's jump back to like, how can guys reach out to you, man? Where can they connect?
Yep. AndrewPettyCoach.com. And I offer a free coaching session for anybody who is looking for some support in a particular area or wants to explore whether a coaching partnership with me would be a good fit for them. On the socials at Andrew Petty Coach. The website for my podcast is andrewpettyisdying.com. And the podcast itself, Andrew Petty is Dying, is available on all the usual platforms.
I appreciate it, my friend. Thank you so much for sharing, so openly and about something that we really don't even think about, our mortality and the extreme impact that can have for us in our actions and decisions. So thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it, man.
My pleasure. And thanks for having me, Mike.
Absolutely.